Chag Sameach, everybody. It's a pleasure to be able to study with you. Shavuot is the holiday of the receiving of the Torah. According to tradition, Jewish tradition, the receiving the Torah took place over 3,500 years ago on Mount Sinai. And according to the biblical tradition, the receiving of the Torah took place once on Mount Sinai, and that Jewish religion, Jewish culture has really evolved from that moment. Everything comes out of the receiving of the Torah. What I want to explore with you today is the idea that it's never so simple. It never is that there's one moment and that everything comes from that one moment. Actually, throughout Jewish history, there have been moments of crises, moments in which Jews have been forced to think about what it means for the Jewish people to continue. Religious moments of crises, physical moments of crises, moments when our religion was challenged, threatened, moments in which our physical existence was threatened. How were we going to continue? We know, just to give an example, in the 20th century, that the Holocaust was one of those moments. And the relationship between the Holocaust and the founding of the State of Israel, even though the relationship is complicated in a way, but that was the way in which the Jews rebuilt from the destruction, from the murder of those 6 million Jews. I'd like to today study with you another one of those moments that took place not in the 20th century, but 2,000 years ago. And that is the moment on the 9th day of Av in the year 70 CE. That was the day that the second temple was destroyed by the Romans. The exact identification of the day as being the 9th of Av is actually an interesting question, because historically we don't have any basis for exactly that date. Josephus says the destruction took place on the 10th of Av. Even the Talmud is not entirely clear exactly what day the destruction took place. The point is, it took place close to the 9th of Av. And the 9th of Av in Jewish history is the day in which bad things happen to the Jewish people. The 9th of Av, says the Talmud, the Torah doesn't say this, but the Talmud says it, that the 9th of Av was the day that the spies came back from their trip to Israel, and that they gave their report, and the people believed the report, and the people who left Israel were not allowed to enter the land of, who left Egypt, were not allowed to enter the land of Israel because they listened to the spies. That took place on the 9th of Av. Says the Talmud, Atem bechitem bechiyah shel chinam, ani ekva lachem kovea lachem bechiyah ledorot. You cried for no reason that night. There was no reason to believe the spies, but I'm going as a punishment to give you a reason to cry. And the 9th of Av is the day in which the temples were destroyed. Throughout Jewish history, other bad events are connected with the destruction of the temple. Whether or not they actually took place on that day, they took place around that day. The expulsion of the Jews from Spain on July 31st, 1492, also took place around Tisha B'Av. Turns out that historically, July 31st was not Tisha B'Av, was the 7th of Av. But at least the people felt as if it was Tisha B'Av. The First World War started, at least on some level, on the 9th of Av. And Jews throughout history have looked to identify the 9th of Av with moments of tragedy and destruction in Jewish history. But the question is not so much to talk about tragedy. It's Shavuot. We don't have to talk about the tragedy, but rather to talk about what the Jews did with the destruction of the temple. Now, it is true that for probably 75 years after the destruction of the temple, the Jews believed that the temple would be rebuilt. So the Jews didn't believe that the temple was destroyed forever. But pretty quickly, in 75 years is pretty quickly, the Jews realized that the temple wasn't going to be rebuilt. And the question was, what do you do without a temple? Now, let's just take for a moment an understanding of exactly why the temple was so significant and so central. The temple, the second temple, as they had it then, was the place in which sacrifices were given. In those days, in those times when there was a temple, there were sacrifices. Whether or not there was communal prayer is not clear, but clearly sacrifices played the primary role and the prayers played a secondary role. That's clear. So number one is, with the destruction of the temple, there are no more sacrifices. But it may be even more significant than that, is that the temple served as a place of gathering in which the Jewish people used to get together at least 3 times a year. We have the verse tells us in the Torah, Shalosh Pamim Bashana, Shalosh Pamim Tachogli Bashana. You should celebrate these 3 holidays. And the way they used to celebrate the holidays was that the people used to travel to Jerusalem. Josephus says, and even if you want to assume that Josephus is exaggerating, which clearly he is, Josephus says that 1 million people used to come to the temple to celebrate the holidays. Now we know, and anybody who's been up on the Temple Mount knows, that there isn't room for 1 million people. So Josephus was exaggerating. But at least in Josephus's mind, it felt like 1 million people. That was the central role of the temple, was the fact that there was this place of gathering. So it was a place of ritual, it was a place of sacrifice, and it was a place of gathering. What do you do when you don't have a temple anymore? So one thing is that you pray for the reestablishment, rebuilding of the temple. And every day in the prayer service that we'll talk about that was established, we pray, B'Yerushalayim ircha b'rachamim tashuv. We pray that we should return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. So in a ritual way, the way you solve the problem of not having a temple is praying that there should be another temple. That's an easy way of dealing with it. But the question is not so much how we today or how Jews throughout history have dealt with the fact that there's no temple. What interests me is, how did they deal with this story or with this crisis in the moment? And here we go back to a very, very famous Talmudic story. The Talmud tells us about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai seemed to have been the leader, you'd say the rabbinic leader, but there weren't really rabbis yet. The leader of the Jews in Jerusalem. It was a very complicated situation pre-70. The Romans were attacking Jerusalem, and there was a debate among the Jews how to respond to the Romans. Should we acquiesce? Should we work with the Romans? Or should we fight the Romans to the end? And this was a huge debate, and Jews were fighting one another as they were fighting the Romans, as often happens. Exactly where Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai fits in to that internal Jewish debate is not entirely clear. But Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai does creatively figure out a way to be taken out of Jerusalem without being killed. He actually asks his students to put him in a coffin and to act as if he's dead. They take him out of Jerusalem, and somehow he's able to meet with the emperor, or the one who is going to become the emperor. He predicts that he's going to become the emperor. The emperor asks Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, what can I get you? What can I give you? You know, you have 3 wishes. What can I give you? And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, 10 li Yavneh v'chachameh. Give me Yavneh and its scholars. Now, even in that sentence, I have a problem. Tein li Yavneh v'chachameha. Give me Yavneh v'chachameha. It sounds like Yavneh was already an established city, and it already had scholars. Give me Yavneh and its scholars. Or maybe give me Yavneh, and I will place scholars in Yavneh. It's not clear. I can only tell you one thing. Josephus tells us that the city of Yavneh, which in Josephus was referred to as Jamnia, was actually not a famous city, not a city of Yavneh v'chachameha, a city of a great Jewish school and academy, a city of a great yeshiva. It was actually a city of refugees. That's where the people from Jerusalem went when they were thrown out of Jerusalem. They went to Yavneh. Give me Yavneh means allow me to survive. Allow me to go to the city of refugees. So actually, the Talmudic legend seems not to reconcile with the historical evidence about Yavneh. Actually, that makes it more interesting. You see, if there was a historical story, I'd have to figure out what the historical story is, and that would be it. But, you know, history meant something different in the 1st century CE. This is important. Professor Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, the great Jewish historian from Harvard and then Columbia, wrote a book called Zachar. And in his book, he explains that really until the early modern period, the period of humanism, Jews didn't study history qua history. Jews studied history and they interpreted history as it related to their religious and ritual well-being. And therefore, the story of Yavneh is not the story of what historically happened. The story of Yavneh is really the story of what did it mean to the history of the Jewish religion, and what difference did it, and how did the Jews use Yavneh as they try to recover from the destruction of the temple. Ten li Yavneh v'chachameha. The first interesting piece of that is that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai recognized that he needed a replacement for Jerusalem. There was not going to be any more Jerusalem. And again, I told you that for about 75 years, the Jews believed that the temple was going to be rebuilt. So this story may have been rewritten later. Could be that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai thought the temple would be rebuilt. But as the Jews looked at it later, they recognized the temple wasn't going to be rebuilt. They needed a new center for their Judaism. And they chose, probably they didn't choose. That's probably not true. Ten li Yavneh v'chachameha sounds like the Jews chose, but I don't believe the Jews chose. I think probably Vespasian, the emperor, and the Romans told the Jews where to go. Ten li Yavneh v'chachameha. The rabbis turned the story on its head. So all of a sudden, instead of the Jews being forced to go to Yavneh, instead, they were given the choice and they chose Yavneh. Give us Yavneh and its scholars. But more than that, that is that the rabbis teach us that at least 2 things happened in Yavneh. The third thing we'll talk about in a minute. But at least according to the Talmud, 2 things happened in Yavneh. The first thing that happened in Yavneh was that prayer replaced sacrifice. in the temple, there were 3 sacrifices given a day. There was a sacrifice given in the morning, there was a sacrifice given in the afternoon, and there was some form of sacrifice given overnight. The rabbis in Yavneh said that we don't have any more sacrifices, and therefore we're going to establish 3 prayer services. Keneged Timidim Tiknu. In replacement for the sacrifices, we are going to establish a ritual service. And that was the Shmona Esrei, that was the Amidah. The Amidah that was recited every single day, 3 days, 3 times a day. The same Amidah that we recite today. That's interesting. Let's talk about that for a minute. The sacrifices were the same sacrifices every day. The Tamid, the daily sacrifice in the morning. The Tamid, the daily sacrifice in the afternoon. And then the sacrifice of the innards of the animal that remained on the altar all night long. The 3 sacrifices. The 3 sacrifices were the same every day. Whether, however you felt, whatever you needed, the sacrifices were the same. There was a need for a consistency of the daily sacrifices, the same sacrifices. The same thing happened when it came to the prayer service. They had a prayer service, the same exact prayer service every single day. Now, the Talmud tells some fascinating stories about this prayer service because, as you would imagine, it was long before printing. Printing is not established till the 15th century. So anything that's written is written by hand. So people didn't have sitters. They prayed by heart. And so therefore there was some spontaneous kind of redoing of the prayer services. But basically, the Talmud and Megillah tells us that there was a very specific prayer service, and that those same prayers, 18 blessings, which became 19 blessings, those same prayers were recited every day. So the first thing they did in Yavneh was they recognized the need to replace, to make up for the fact that there was no longer a prayer service. Sorry, there was no longer a sacrificial service. And therefore they needed a prayer service instead of the sacrificial service. That's number 1. Number 2, the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah tells us an interesting thing. The Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah tells us that we blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah. What happens if Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbat? Says the Mishnah that they used to blow shofar in Jerusalem at the place of the temple, but nowhere else. After the temple was destroyed, they used to blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah that fell on Shabbat, only in Yavneh. Now, that also is something that we should think about for a minute. The first thing, establishing the prayer service, the tefillot, the amidah, that was done in Yavneh, but Yavneh was not significant. That's just where it was done. Here, when it comes to blowing the shofar, actually the place is important. Whoever established the fact that the shofar is blown on Shabbat in Yavneh understood the significance of place. Place is important. And Yavneh replaces Jerusalem. There needs to be a place where which is going to be treated differently, which is going to be holy. It's not Jerusalem. Jerusalem's a city that goes back to biblical times. It's not Jerusalem. But the significance of place is important, even if it's not Jerusalem. And just to explain it, the rabbis explain that we don't blow shofar on Shabbat because we're afraid that you might carry the shofar, and you're not allowed to carry on Shabbat. But in Jerusalem, they weren't afraid they were going to carry it to Jerusalem. The fear of Jerusalem was upon them. So too in Yavneh. The fear of Yavneh was upon the people. Again, here you go, the significance of place. So what you have in Yavneh is you have a rabbinic conclave, you have a rabbinic group that establishes the Amidah, that establishes the prayer service. But also you have a group that establishes the fact that the place of Yavneh is significant, and that place is treated differently than all other places. You see that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and his successors understood the need for a central place, a place of meeting, a place of religious significance and holiness. And that was the place of Yavneh. Now, there is a tradition called the Council of Yavneh. You can look it up, Council of Yavneh. The tradition is that in the Council of Yavneh, which met sometime within, 30 or 50 years after the destruction of the temple, that in that council in Yavneh, they decided on the canonization of the Bible, which means in simple English, they decided which books would be included in the Bible, the Jewish Bible, and which books would not be included in the Jewish Bible. And that was the moment that they made that decision in Yavneh. That was one of the decisions. One of the things they did is they established the Amidah. One thing is they established Yavneh as a holy place. And the third is they decided on the canon. Probably that's not true. The historians today say that it's just not true. That the Bible, the 24 books of the Bible as we have them, were not decided in some meeting that they had in some secret place in Yavneh. It didn't work that way. The decision which books to include and which books not to include was a decision that was made probably over generations, maybe even over centuries. Some books were included, some books were not included. And then there were the books in which they had a debate. The Talmud tells us there was a debate about some of the books. Some of the books made it, some of the books didn't make it. Some of the books, it's hard to understand how they made it, like Shir HaShirim. And some of the books, it's hard to understand why they didn't make it, like the book of Judith, like the book of Ben Sira. But for whatever reason, some books made it and some books did not make it. But that wasn't decided in Yavneh. But what's interesting, and that's the old tradition about legend and fact. Sometimes the legend is stronger than the fact. So the fact that there is a legend about the Council of Yavneh, the fact that there's a legend that in the Council of Yavneh, they decided which books would be included in the Tanakh, that in itself is interesting, even though it's actually not true. Even though it probably didn't happen in Yavneh that way, doesn't matter. The point is that they believe that it happened then, or some people believe that it happened then. So Yavneh replaced Jerusalem. Yavneh was the religious center of the Jewish people. And from Yavneh, the Jews, Yavneh is actually in the middle of Israel, kind of south of Tel Aviv, next to the coast. From Yavneh, the Jews moved north to Tiberia and to other places, to Tiberias and other places. And then eventually many of the Jews moved to Babylonia, and the center of the Jewish people moved to Babylonia. Then the Muslims took over in the 7th century, and the Jewish people really spread out all throughout the Muslim world. That's the story. And Yavneh was the central place that basically saved Judaism. This story, this rendition, the way I just presented it to you, basically tells us that Judaism was saved by Yavneh. Yochanan ben Zakkai had the foresight to understand that you need a central place. Jerusalem was no longer a viable option. And therefore they chose Yavneh as being that central place. And from Yavneh, the Jewish people spread out, but Judaism was saved in Yavneh. So I want to tell you something. That's a nice story. Generally speaking, as a historian, you have to always be suspicious about stories that are too easy and nice. The idea that Jerusalem is destroyed, the temple is destroyed, the Jews have nothing, and all of a sudden they snap their fingers and they have Yavneh, and they have an Amidah, and they have a city where they blow shofar and they canonize the Bible. It's too nice. It's too easy. It sounds like that's a reworking of history. It sounds like that's what they decided after the fact to make it seem as if it was seamless, because that's something to the credit of the Jews, of the rabbis. And actually, the rabbis in those days wrote the history books, and the rabbis are the ones who saved Judaism. So give the rabbis the credit. They established the Amidah. They established the city as being a central holy place. They canonized the Bible. So they established it. They wrote the history books. But you know what? When things are too simple, you know that you need to go back and try to understand the complications. And what I want to do with you today is I want to just take a little bit of a journey through Jewish history. Actually, this journey is going to be a journey of the entire 500 or so years that the Second Temple stood. I want to try to understand what was the Second Temple, how did it work, and what did the Jews try to do after the Second Temple? Well, the First Temple is destroyed in 586 BCE. It's destroyed by the Babylonians, and the Jews mostly were exiled to Babylonia. The Second Temple is rebuilt some 70 years later with the permission of Cyrus, the king of Persia. The temple is destroyed by the Babylonians, but during those 70 years during which the temple is destroyed, the Persians defeat the Babylonians, and Cyrus becomes the great king. Cyrus gives permission for the Jews to rebuild the temple, probably because before the age of communication, he figured that the best way to have happy and loyal constituents was to give them each their own place of worship, their own temple, and then they'll be loyal to Cyrus. And it kind of worked out pretty well. So the Second Temple was built. But you should know that most of the Jews, or many of the Jews, believed that the Second Temple was not as good as the First Temple. First of all, it was built with the permission of a Gentile king. The First Temple was built by King Solomon with credit given to King David. And here the Second Temple is built by King Cyrus. There are no prophets, right? The First Temple is built with prophets. There are no prophets. There are no miracles, right? You don't really read miracles like in the description of the building of the First Temple. And Ezra and Nehemiah, who are the leaders of the Jews who take the Jews back from Babylonia to Israel, they criticize the people. They criticize the people for not being religious enough, for taking non-Jewish wives, and they criticize the Kohanim. Now, the Second Temple continues, taken over by the Greeks. And then in the 2nd century CE, we read about the Maccabees. Now, we know the good story about the Maccabees, right? The Maccabees defeat the Hellenists, the Greek Syrians. They go into the temple. Maybe they rekindle the lights, and the lights last for 8 days. But what we don't know about, or what we don't talk about so much, is the fact that the Maccabees very quickly became corrupt. Jonathan, the brother of Judah Maccabee, instilled himself as the high priest and also as the king. That's bad. Not allowed to do that. We know all the way back from the time of, all the way back from the time of the Torah, the blessing that Jacob gave to his sons. We know that the Kohanim are the Kohanim, and Lo Yasur Shevet Mi Yehuda, the kingship goes to Judah. And therefore the king and the high priest cannot be the same person. They're not allowed to be the same person. And therefore, the Maccabees broke the rules. So here you have a Second Temple which is built by a Gentile king, in which many of the Jews don't even return from Babylonia, no prophets, no miracles. And actually, the second temple very quickly becomes corrupt. Now, what happens when that second temple becomes corrupt? It's interesting. What do you do when your religious center becomes corrupt? It doesn't mean all the people are corrupt. It means the religious leadership is corrupt. It means there are Kohanim or high priests who buy the high priesthood, who are not necessarily themselves Kohanim. It means that the Kohen and the king is taken by the same person. What do you do when religious leadership becomes corrupt? Now, what happened among the Jewish people, and again, different people have different stories. What happened was the beginning of something called sectarianism. What is a sect? A sect is a religious group, but it's a religious group that defines itself and rejects all other religious groups. You see, today we have many different groups within Judaism, and they define Judaism differently. But the beginning of this idea was really found during the Second Temple. You see, what you had a temple. The temple, more than anything else, was the great unifier. It kept the Jews together. The minute that they start questioning the temple, and when I say questioning the temple, I mean they question the leadership, it doesn't unify anymore. Well, the minute that the temple doesn't unify, what you're going to have is you're going to have sectarianism. You're going to have different sects, different groups that are going to reject the other groups because they think the other groups are corrupt. And therefore, here we have these different groups. The group of leadership in the temple, which was the Maccabees, and then the Maccabees quickly evolved into a group called the Sadducees. They were the aristocracy. Not surprised about that. They're the priests, or at least the people who bought the priesthood. And they're the aristocracy. They're the people of Jerusalem. They're the priests, or the people who buy the priesthood. But they're also the people who everybody else rejects. You see, again, the aristocracy, their job is to unite the people. Their job is to bring everybody together. The minute that they're corrupt, the minute that they take what doesn't really belong to them, that means you're going to have splinter groups that don't accept the aristocracy. And if you don't accept the aristocracy, what's going to happen is that you're not going to accept the temple either, because the temple is being run by the aristocracy. And the minute you don't have a temple and the people aren't unified around the temple, what do you have left? Who were these other groups? Well, one of these groups was a group called the Essenes. We know this group by another name, actually called the people of Qumran, or the Dead Sea sects. These are people who thought that the Sadducees, the Maccabees, the aristocracy in Jerusalem was corrupt. They rejected this aristocracy. They rejected the temple. And they created their own sect in the Judean hills. They actually looked forward to a temple that would be built by God. Again, I told you that people didn't like the second temple because it was built by a Gentile king and there were no prophets and there were no miracles. They looked forward to a temple that would be built by God. So basically, they completely rejected Jerusalem. Now, exactly how powerful this group in Qumran in the Dead Sea was, it's hard to know. Because by the time we know them, 100 years or 150 years later, they're gone. They disappeared. We'll talk about where they went, but they disappeared. Interestingly, we do have many of their writings, because starting in 1947, when they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, many of the writings of this group were found. The tefillin of this group was found. The fact that they accepted the different books of the Bible was found. Actually, we have fragments of every book of the Bible from the Dead Sea sect, except for the book of Esther, for whatever reason, maybe just by chance, but that's a whole discussion among scholars. What do you see from that? What you see from that is something that's unbelievable. What you see from that is that the Essenes very much were part of the Jewish world. Now, they had different traditions, and they were more ascetic in the sense of being separatists, but that was their rejection of Jerusalem. But they were very much part of the Jewish world, yet they rejected Jerusalem. They rejected the priests. They rejected the temple. They were a sect. They did not accept what was going on in Jerusalem. They never went to Jerusalem. They believed that the temple was going to be built by God. That was the first sect. Then you had the Samaritans. The Samaritans, who were more marginally Jewish, and again, this isn't the time to discuss it, but interesting. They rejected Jerusalem in favor of their own temple on Mount Gerizim. That also goes back to the Bible. Mount Gerizim is near Nablus, near Shechem. And they had their temple, and actually they still have services there. They still have sacrificial services. There still are Samaritans, and they still have sacrificial services on Mount Gerizim. But again, you have a group of Jews who reject Jerusalem. And unlike the Dead Sea sect, which rejected Jerusalem, but didn't actually have their own temple, but they believed that God would build the temple, the Samaritans have their own temple on Mount Gerizim. That's the second group. And then you have the Christians. The Christians rejected Jerusalem. They rejected the temple. They said that temple would be replaced by Jesus, that you didn't need a physical temple, that everything would be through Jesus. But again, the third group, that because of the corruption, because of the arrogance of the people of Jerusalem, they reject Jerusalem and they create their own religion. The Essenes, the Samaritans, and the Christians. And then you had another group, the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees were an interesting group. The Pharisees were just the common people, and they lived in Jerusalem among other people. They actually, their way of rejecting the aristocracy, the Sadducees, was not so much to outright reject the temple, but rather what they did was they tried to observe the temple rituals within their own homes. And therefore the laws of ritual purity, tumah and tahara, they observed in their own homes. They said, we don't need the temple. The temple is corrupt. The temple's run by the Sadducees. We don't like the temple. We will do all those things on our own. And so therefore they didn't have their own temple, but they try to create their own home as a miniature temple. In a sense, we have we have a similar idea in trying to turn our table, our Shabbat table, into a miniature altar, a miniature temple. That really comes from the Pharisees. So you have the Sadducees, you have the aristocracy, and then you have those who rejected the aristocracy. the Essenes, the Samaritans, the Christians, the Pharisees. But what happened during this period, and that's the important piece of this puzzle, what happened during this period is that these groups had nothing to do with one another. There was no longer a united Jewish front, a united Jewish people. Every group was on their own. And as the Romans took over Jerusalem in the year 63 BCE, there was no united front against Jerusalem. The Romans came, the Romans controlled the temple, and eventually the Romans destroyed the temple from 66 to 70 CE. The Romans destroyed the temple. And what happened when the Romans destroyed the temple? So when the Romans destroyed the temple, there's no need for sects anymore. That's right. The sects were rebelling against the temple, but there's no more temple. So the Essenes disappear. We don't know anything about the Essenes. They don't exist anymore. Maybe something happened in the Judean hills, but for some reason they don't exist anymore. The Samaritans kind of also disappeared. I mean, we have a few of them, but they also disappeared. Christianity splits from Judaism. Now, I know that that story is more complicated than just that, and that takes a lot more time. But basically, Christianity splits from Judaism. And what you and the Sadducees, the aristocracy, well, they're no longer aristocracy, because the reason they were the aristocracy is because they ran the temple. But the minute that there's no more temple and they're thrown out of Jerusalem, that's the end of it. Who are the ones who control? So that's the story of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Who was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai? He wasn't a priest. He wasn't part of the aristocracy. He was a regular person. And it was those people, the people who understood the importance of Judaism long term. Ten li Yavneh v'chachamecha. Give me Yavneh and its scholars, right? I don't need Jerusalem. Jerusalem was a cause of division among the Jewish people. I understand that for Judaism to continue, we need Yavneh and we need its scholars. Those scholars eventually became rabbis. And those rabbis are the rabbis who composed the Mishnah and the Talmud and the oral tradition by which we live to this very day. But the question really is a bigger question. And that is, what is it? So we don't have sects anymore, right? After the destruction of the temple, we don't have sects anymore. Ten li Yavneh v'chachamecha. Seems to be that the Jews continued. Christianity broke away, but they broke away as their own religion. So that doesn't really count. The other sects disappear. We don't have sectarianism within Judaism anymore. Everybody seems to work within the same rules, so to speak. Everybody is part of Yavneh. And the question is, what is it that allowed the Jews to continue? What was it about Yavneh? Why was Yavneh so important in the history of the Jewish people? And I think the answer to that question is actually in a story that we are familiar with, but I want to read it together with you, maybe with a slightly different perspective. The Talmud tells us the most famous story of all, the story of Tanur Shel Achnai. And this is known as the oven of Achnai. The Gemara asks, what's the relevance of Achnai, a snake, in this context? Rabbi Yehuda said that Shmuel said it is characterized in that matter due to the fact that the rabbis surrounded it with their statements like the snake, which often forms a coil when it rests, and deems it impure. The sages taught. On that day when they discussed this matter, whatever the matter was a matter of ritual purity and impurity. Rabbi Eliezer, one of the rabbis, answered all possible answers in the world to support his opinion. There was a disagreement between Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbi, but the rabbis did not accept his explanation from him. After failing to convince the rabbis logically, Rabbi Eliezer said to them, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, this carob tree will prove it. The carob tree was uprooted from its place 100 cubits, and some say 400 cubits. The rabbi said to him, one does not cite halachic proof from the carob tree. Rabbi Eliezer then said to them, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, the stream will prove it. The water in the stream turned backwards and began flowing in the opposite direction. They said to him, one does not cite proof, halachic proof, from a stream. Rabbi Eliezer then said to them, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, the walls of the study hall will prove it. The walls of the study hall leaned inward and began to fall. Rabbi Yehoshua, one of the rabbis, one of the majority, scolded the walls and said to them, if Torah scholars are contending with each other in matters of halacha, what is the nature of your involvement in this dispute? The Gemara relates, the walls did not fall because of the deference due Rabbi Yehoshua, but they did not straighten because of the deference due Rabbi Eliezer. And then you have a great postscript, and they still remain leaning. Rabbi Eliezer then said to them, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, heaven will prove it. A divine voice, a bat kol, emerged from heaven and said, why are you differing with Rabbi Eliezer? As the halacha is in accordance with his opinion in every place that he expresses an opinion. Rabbi Yehoshua stood on his feet and said, it is written, it is not in heaven. Lo bashamayim. The Gemara asks, what is the relevance of the phrase, it is not in heaven, in this context? Rabbi Yirmiyah said, since the Torah was already given at Mount Sinai, we do not regard a divine voice. As you already wrote at Mount Sinai in the Torah, after a majority to incline. Since the majority of rabbis disagreed with Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, the halacha is not ruled in accordance with his opinion. The Gemara relates years after, this is the best postscript of all, Rabbi Natan encountered Elijah the prophet and said to him, what did the Holy One, blessed be he, do at this time when Rabbi Yehoshua issued his declaration? Elijah, Eliyahu Hanavi, said to him, the Holy One, blessed be he, smiled and said, my children have triumphed over me. My children have triumphed over me. What is that story? The story of the oven of Achnai, a dispute between Rabbi Eliezer, one of the great rabbis, 2nd century, and the rabbis. Rabbi Eliezer brings every proof in the world that he's right. He even has a heavenly voice that comes down and says that he's right. But, say the rabbis, we don't care what the heavenly voice says because we follow the majority. The Torah says follow the majority, and therefore we follow the majority. What is the story? The story goes on, and they excommunicate Rabbi Eliezer, not for us, not for now. What I want to argue, and this point is really made by Professor Shaya Cohn of Harvard. What I want to argue is the significance of Yavneh is not in those stories that we started with. Ten li Yavneh v'chachameha. Somehow this quasi-holy city of Yavneh. That was rewritten later by the rabbis. What I want to argue is that if you want to really understand what the rabbis got right, what the rabbis understood, what the Pharisees understood after the destruction of the temple, what they understood, explains Professor Cohn, is that if you want to create a people, you have to know how to argue with one another. You have to know how to dispute one another. You have to know how to have a fight. You see, that's the problem with sectarianism. The problem with sectarianism is they don't know how to have a fight. I go to my corner, you go to your corner. But even when the bell rings, we don't go to the middle. We each stay in our corner. That is not going to create a Jewish people. The story of the oven of Achnai tells us that the rabbis knew how to engage with one another. Now, not every engagement is going to end well. And the story of the oven of Achnai doesn't end well. Rabbi Eliezer is excommunicated, and it's a very ugly situation. But they knew how to communicate with one another. They knew how to argue with one another. The entire Talmud is a book of arguments and disagreements. And interestingly, the Talmud very, very often doesn't come to a conclusion. The conclusion comes later, maybe hundreds of years later. Who's right? Who's wrong? What should you do? What shouldn't you do? When do you say Shema? When don't you say Shema? When do you blow the shofar? When don't you blow the shofar? All of those kinds of things. That's not what we're interested in. What Yavneh represented was the ability to argue with one another, to disagree with one another. And that's why Judaism continued. Ten li Yavneh v'chachameha. Give me Yavneh and its scholars. That was a very, very important moment. But it was an important moment not because there was some kind of quasi-holiness to Yavneh. Give me Yavneh and its scholars, because the leaders of Yavneh, we don't know who they are exactly. Yochanan ben Zakkai was the first one, Rabbi Gamliel. We don't know who understood this importance of arguing, of disagreeing. But the rabbis understood it. And Judaism really grew around this ability to disagree with one another, to argue with one another, but to remain all part of the same team. That's what it was about, remaining part of the same team. During the period of sectarianism, everybody was on their own team. They couldn't function that way. And the fact that Judaism to this very day is, they still refer to it as being a Talmudic Judaism, a Judaism in which we argue with one another. We disagree. This opinion says do it this way, and this opinion says do it that way. But we're all one people. That's what we learned from Yavneh. And as we celebrate the receiving of the Torah on Mount Sinai, we recognize that it wasn't only that one moment on Mount Sinai, but actually Jews throughout history have had to deal with crisis moments, with moments in which it looked like we may not survive. One of those moments was the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. We survived, not because we had a holy city, not because we had a city like Jerusalem. It doesn't work that way. The reason that we survived is because we learned how to argue with one another. Let that be our legacy for many generations to come. Chag Sameach.